Dear friends, today we are excited to present to you an English-translated interview with Sergey Lavrov. This interview was given by Mr. Lavrov for the documentary film MGIMO 80. Enjoy watching.
What is it for you? It's possible to talk endlessly about it. This is the alma mater, this is the house by the Moskva River. Because when MGIMO was housed in the current building of the Diplomatic Academy, a very cozy, warm house where we not only had an established educational process, but where we put on amazing skits. Spent evenings, organized musical evenings, because our course and some other courses had their own orchestras. And of course, there we met our teachers, many of whom remained our good friends, although they have already passed away from this life. In particular, I would like to mention Alexander Belkovich, my teacher of the Sinhalese language, who not only taught us, but after classes we went outside, went to the nearest yard on Prechistenka, where there was a hockey box, and played football together with our teacher and his friends. So there are a lot of absolutely unique moments left in my memory from the point of view of the formation of myself and my classmates, as individuals who already own many secrets, although not all of them, of international life, diplomatic activity. And at the same time, the place where we aspired, as you know, to a hearth, to a warm hearth, firm where it spread very pleasant atmosphere. What challenges do you think we are facing now? MGIMO always faces challenges, regardless of how the international situation develops, when it is quieter. The challenges were to increase its specialties, as it is now customary to say, to ensure compliance of bachelor's and master's degrees with high global standards recognized by global standards. And MGIMO has absolutely succeeded in this. But at the same time, he did not just try to pull himself up, then it was fashionable for the Bologna process. Now all this is being reviewed quite seriously, and we are returning to an education system that will preserve and renew all the best that was in the Tsarist Empire and in the Soviet Union. But MGIMO has always sought in those times when we interacted with the West, it has always sought to look for something of its own, to offer some new directions that would reflect our national historical specifics. And when times have become more tense, the situation, of course, requires much more serious actions. Russians have been trying to hammer into Western minds the inadmissibility of Ukraine's involvement in NATO, the inadmissibility of nurturing the regime that came to power as a result of a coup. And one of their main tasks was to destroy the Russian language, Russian culture, and Russian education. When all the means were already there, exhausted when we realized that the so-called Minsk agreements were honestly admitted by the heads, the then heads of France and Germany and Ukraine, no one was going to fulfill. They were needed to choose the time and arm Ukraine against Russia. You all know that. But when, having exhausted all imaginable means to convince the West to be reasonable, to misfire and warn your Ukrainian customers, and we launched a special military operation. The West, apparently realizing that its plan to make Ukraine anti-Russia failed and took out anger on including educational contacts. All contacts between our countries, between Russia and the West, Russia and the European Union, Russia, NATO, Russia and the United States were severed overnight, including educational. And of course, then the main burden of work significantly shifted to the East. Not because we refused the West, refused to cooperate, sacrificing to our unrealized ambitions in Ukraine. Even such an area as education, culture, which has always united people, and not served as an instrument of sanctions. If the West thought that by doing so it would undermine the foundations of our education, then it was cruelly mistaken. As I have already said, this only stimulated the reform of education, a careful, thorough reform, which is aimed at preserving all that useful was acquired in recent years, the post-Soviet years. But to return to this education system, the invaluable experience of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Now MGIMO pays more attention to the study of Oriental languages. I am pleased with this, because I myself studied the rare Sinhalese language, and then used it while working in Sri Lanka, for the first 4 years after graduation, but not only. And country studies, the study of the economies of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, are developing. At the same time, I note that MGIMO has retained both bachelor's and master's degrees in English. Teachers, foreign teachers of foreign languages, have almost all stayed and fulfill their contractual obligations. And they do it voluntarily, and, I'm not afraid of this word, with pleasure, because it's good for them to live in Russia and work at one of the best universities in our country. I would say that we have used, and now we are using the experience of the Russian Empire more and more. In the Russian Empire, there was such a specialty as dragoman, when a person was specialized in universities. In order to work in one specific geographical direction, sometimes quite narrow in the direction of one state. But this state, this man, who was called dragoman, knew thoroughly. And probably, it is difficult to return to the production of such specialists in full, but it is a fact that in our tradition, the emphasis has always been on training experts who know the region in depth. Unlike, say, the American system or the system of many Western European countries, which send diplomats to one country for 2 or 3 years, which he has not studied. Then, after 2 or 3 years, they send completely opposite regions to another place, and have also never been studied by this person. Rotation, rotation. We also use rotation, of course, but not as an end in itself. The main specialty, after all. MGIMO in modern conditions, more attention is paid to the work of the Asianist Center of Russia at MGIMO. Where students from Southeast Asian countries study, attention has increased, academic hours have expanded. Similar processes are now developing at MGIMO in relation to students from the African continent. He actively participates in youth events and educational events within the framework of the BRICS. This makes it possible to actively involve students from Latin American countries, exchange experience with the leading universities of the continent. The health-improving effect of what is happening on the processes of training specialists for all spheres of public life within our institute. Continued. How do you see the future of the university in 10 or 15 years? Light. The future will definitely be bright because MGIMO has proved, as I tried to point out in my previous statements. It has shown its ability to adapt to new conditions, but not only to adapt and act as a leader in a number of areas. Now digital technologies, digitalization of the educational process and the scientific process is the basis that will help to actively promote the competencies, rich competencies of MGIMO for the training of specialists of the highest level. And, importantly, for the development of analytical work in cooperation with other academic institutions, in cooperation with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a more in-depth analysis of difficult, to a certain extent, long-matured trends in the international arena, where there is a direct clash of the West, which is no longer shy and does not hide its dictatorial habits, demands submission to its will of everyone and everything. From the West, which has probably forgotten, or at least has thrown aside all diplomatic methods, and switched to the methods of sanctions, blackmail, threats, direct provocations, the use of military force for regime change, for terrorist acts that weaken its competitors in the global economy.
Отбросил в сторону все дипломатические методы и перешел к методам санкций, шантажа, угроз, прямых провокаций, использования военной силы для смены режимов, для террористических актов, которые ослабляют его конкурентов в мировой экономике.
Now everyone is hearing about the terrorist attack on the northern streams, which Europe silently, submissively swallowed. Although this terrorist attack undermined the development opportunities of Germany, and to a large extent, all other European countries, and made them in the economy, in finance, in energy issues, but simply appendages of the United States. Times are like this. Everyone obeys the hegemon in the hope that the hegemon will protect them. And the hegemon only takes from you, and even if you are his ally, only what he needs, and then discards it, as already spent material. And everyone understands that this is a system of international relations which still contains this extremely negative trend. Led by the Anglo-Saxons, it has outlived its own. But she does not want to die, because the West does not want to move to equal relations. After 5 centuries of domination by seizing foreign lands, by destroying the indigenous population in North America, Africa, and other parts of the world, the West is used to living at the expense of colonial methods, and now it wants to do it by neo-colonial methods. Not so associated with the direct extermination of entire peoples as with such sophisticated forms of their exploitation. But the point is the same, both in colonial times, and now the West wants to live at the expense of others. Removing the colonial rent and slowing down the technological development of the rest of the world. But it opposes this agony. Although this agony can last for many years, it opposes the absolutely objective historical trend of the formation of a multipolar world order. First of all, the main principle of the UN Charter will be implemented in practice, the sovereign equality of states, non-interference in their internal affairs, and, of course, where an equal process aimed at balancing interests will be ensured. The search for a balance of interests, and not the imposition of someone's will. The process is long, the confrontation is tough, but the historical truth is on our side, and, of course, no one can stop these objective trends. And, as I have already said, by raising his analytical work to a new level, he makes a very significant contribution to the awareness of these processes and the development of recommendations for government agencies, primarily for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and through us for the country's leadership, on how we optimally build a line to promote the formation of a multipolar world in every possible way.
по всяческому содействию формированию многополярного мира.
Sergey Viktorovich, tell us a vivid story about the time of studying at the Institute. Well, just tell everything like that. You know, these stories would be enough for many hours of conversation. I will say again that it was a happiness for me to study at the Institute.
Что для меня было счастьем учиться в институте.
And studying, which we really tried to devote serious time and pay serious attention to, although it didn't always work out that way in our youth.
Не всегда так получалось, но
We studied well. Probably, we could have done even better, but we do not regret anything. We thank our teachers.
не жалеем, благодарим наших преподавателей.
But, speaking of funny stories, I mentioned cabbage bushes.
Я упомянул капустники.
Once every 6 months, once a semester, our course. The Faculty of International Relations, graduating 1972nd year, regularly put on cabbage rolls.
1972 года регулярно ставил капустники.
The three of us wrote the cabbage rolls.
Мы втроем.
There is our main author Georgy Zelenin, who works at UNESCO, worked for a very long time at UNESCO in the Secretariat, and several other participants, Alexei Fedotov, who was ambassador to the Czech Republic on the topic of Slovakia. Now he is retired, but also your humble servant.
Отставки. Ну и ваш покорный слуга.
When the cabbage rolls were written, it was all rhymed necessarily in verse.
Мы
This was the agreement. They were taken to the party committee, where our texts, although sometimes they were quite sharp, especially at that time, the mid-late 60s, early 70s, in general, were viewed quite liberally, and understood the humor that we were engaged in at that time, and understood that it contributes to everything that they did. They began to make cabbage rolls, to play these cabbage rolls.
юмор, которым мы тогда занимались, и понимали, что он способствует, вот все, что мы делали, ставя капустники, разыгрывая эти капустники, мы
If you want, it was part of what is now called team building, when the course felt involved not just in the learning process.
сопричастность не просто к учебному процессу,
I arrived at 9 in the morning. 4 pairs later, I went to the library or home. But when you have a real circle of friends formed on the course,
формировался реальный круг друзей.
and our course, let other graduates of other years not scold me, but I may have a subjective feeling.
Не ругают, но у меня может быть субъективное ощущение.
Our course is one of the most friendly. Until recently, we have been meeting as graduates, usually going to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Собираемся обычно в МИДе.
Here on the ground floor, we have a corresponding room. We recall the past days. A couple of times they even put a cabbage patch among the invariable participants of the cabbage patch mentioned. Anatoly Vasilyevich Torkunov.
Упомяну Анатолия Васильевича Таркунова.
His best roles. This is Famusov in a parody of Woe Firm Wit and Cardinal in several editions. In several episodes of the TV series Three Musketeers.
Оригинал в нескольких изданиях, в нескольких эпизодах сериала «Три мушкетера».
Therefore, this feeling, the feeling that after academic hours you in fact do not really want to go home and stay.
Академических часов тебе, собственно, не очень хочется домой уходить, и остаемся
There was a very nice cafeteria on the 4th floor.
на 4-м этаже.
They chatted, came up with something, planned new things, including planned trips to construction teams.
Поездки в стройотряды.
All 4 years after the first, second, third, fourth year, I went to MGIMO construction teams to Caucasia, Tuva, Yakutia, and the Far East. These are also unforgettable months of our lives.
Это тоже незабываемые месяцы нашей жизни.
This is a period that further hardened us, allowed us to feel like men, if you want.
Закалил, позволил почувствовать себя мужиками, если хотите.
Physical and very, very hard work.
Весьма нелегкий труд.
digging of canals, installation of concrete structures as part of land reclamation, irrigation programs, construction of special facilities, as it was in Yakutia.
Специальных объектов, как это было в Якутии.
I'm in Yakutia, probably I'm going to finish this now. I was a foreman in Yakutia. We worked on the basis of the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the Republic, made premises there for storing building materials. Some other work went to the building that was being built near Yakutsk, and carried heavy radiators on the floors.
В здании, которое строилось тюрьмы под Якутском, и разносили по этажам тяжеленные радиаторы.
They dug trenches in which they laid the cable and much more.
Укладывали кабель, ну и многое другое.
But another team in our Yakut detachment worked on the construction of the Yakutsk winery.
На строительстве винного завода Якутска.
There are all houses on stilts, and so they did, concreted the space under the house, which, under the building that was raised on stilts. We exchanged evenings, we also had an orchestra there, we sang songs, arranged some dances.
Мы обменивались вечерами, у нас тоже там был оркестр, мы песни пели, какие-то даже танцы устраивали.
Local guys came once a week, and we exchanged impressions of the working day.
Впечатлениями от рабочего дня.
And those who worked on the construction of the winery have always somehow noted the specifics of this object.
Этого объекта.
Not so long ago, about 4 years ago, one of my friends was in Yakutsk and brought me a photo of a sign that hangs at this winery.
И привез мне фотографию таблички, которая висит на этом винном заводе.
It says the wine factory of the city of Yakutsk was commissioned in 1976 year, and below the phrase Saint Lavrov, now working as Minister of Foreign Affairs, took part in its construction.
Фраза в его строительстве принимал участие С.В. Лавров, ныне работающий министром иностранных дел.
First of all, this is certainly not true, although I am proud that my stay in Yakutsk as a member of the construction team was remembered. And secondly, what surprised me, this construction team worked in 1970, and there was already a winery building.
И уже было здание винного завода.
They did separate concrete work there. But it turned out from this plate that it was put into operation only after 6 years.
Только через 6 лет. Ну, вот
Such were the shortcomings of the Soviet economy, the long-term construction.
советской экономики долгострой
Now it's all in the past.
в прошлом.
But there were many other funny moments, especially if you remember how we prepared for exams sometimes.
Если вспоминать, как мы готовились к экзаменам иногда,
The 2 or 3 days that were between exams were sometimes spent not with textbooks.
порой проводили не за учебниками,
And on the last night, I remember we had such a case when my friend and I realized that we did not know international law well. And the exam was for tomorrow.
моим товарищам понимали, что международное право мы с ним, в общем-то, плохо знаем, а экзамен был на завтра.
And so we came to his house. He lived alone. His parents were abroad.
Были за границей.
He read a textbook of public international law, and I read private international law. Read it how? We had about 8 hours. We read for 4 hours. For an hour, everyone told each other what he remembered after reading his textbook. But they passed in general. I don't want to belittle the quality of MGIMO exams, but apparently this method, at least at that moment, was also useful for these two people.
По крайней мере, в тот момент для этих двух людей тоже оказался полезным.
The Russian School of International Relations, its traditions, values. Traditions, first of all, cherish traditions, cherish and multiply what your ancestors did, what your predecessors did.
То, что сделали предки, то, что сделали твои предшественники.
Not to abandon the roots, but to do everything to promote traditions, to promote their civilizational purpose, in such a way that there are more friends.
Цивилизационное предназначение таким способом, чтобы было больше друзей.
But there is another caveat.
Другая оговорка.
Friends are not at the cost of fundamental concessions to their national interests.
Национальных интересов.
We have always, since the days of Ivan the Terrible's diplomacy, the embassy order, have always been ready to develop foreign policy in all directions, what is now called multivector. And we have always been ready to negotiate honestly on the basis of a balance of interests. Unfortunately, it didn't always work out. Very often in European history, they tried to isolate us by and large, deceive us, promise something somewhere, and then assemble coalitions against us. This has happened more than once in European history. And, in fact, those who made it, then in their memoirs, in fact, admitted that they never wanted Russia to be an equal participant in what is called a European concert. But nevertheless, Russia has always, even when it failed, after that gathered, concentrated, as Gorchakov said, and returned the place that rightfully belongs to it, according to the right of history, according to the right of those conquests that we inherited. But now is one of those periods when war has been declared on us. I don't see any difference from the war that Hitler declared on us. Did not declare, or rather, just attacked without declaring war. But at least Hitler was more honest. He wanted to destroy the Soviet Union, to conquer our lands. To this end, he conquered more than half of Europe, put all alien armies at the service of his goals, and as a Superman, declaring the German Superman, began this war against the Soviet Union. Now Napoleon has also gathered almost all of Europe under his banners to declare war on Russia. Now the same group of countries, with rare exceptions, even more than there were, say, in Hitler's coalition. About 50 countries are now financing and arming Kiev, openly declaring the task of inflicting strategic defeat on Russia. At the same time, adults are even ashamed of them, while they say, yes, Russia must be defeated strategically. But we are not at war with Russia. But they cannot even honestly admit, as Napoleon and Hitler did, modern leaders simply do not have the spirit, although the goal is the same, and leads them to the strategic defeat of Russia. Under Hitler, they were led by a Superman, and now they are led by exceptional nations, as Americans. American presidents from both the Democratic and Republican parties have always called their country an exceptional nation, an eccentric. I think they haven't forgotten the historical examples after all. And I don't know what they're hoping for, to be honest. But, as our president said, returning to the traditions and principles of our diplomacy, we never refuse to negotiate. And in the case of Ukraine, this is the clearest example. After all, in February of the 2014 year, we supported the agreement that Yanukovych reached with the opposition. Under the guarantee of France, Germany, and Poland, an agreement on holding early elections, which the opposition, all those who followed those events are convinced, would have won 100%. In other words, it was about being patient for a few months, holding these early elections, and legitimately taking power positions in the Ukrainian state. No, the opposition was not enough. It did not want to wait. It was impatient. Instead of fulfilling these agreements, which Russia supported, they staged a coup, a lot of provocations, bloody events on the Maidan. They signed it last night, and this morning they staged this massacre. If this had not happened, Ukraine would now be within the borders of 1991st year, including Donbass and Crimea. Russians, however, having seized power, the first thing they did was announce that they would revoke the status of the Russian language in Ukraine, that they would expel Russians from Crimea, sent armed militants there, and began to storm the Crimean parliament. Of course, Crimea rebelled, and of course, our military from the Sevastopol base supported the Crimeans, did not allow bloodshed. And of course, Donbass rebelled, which refused to accept that power. But that's not what I'm talking about right now. If the agreements that Russia supported were fulfilled, and we are always for negotiations, for compromises, Ukraine would now be in full integrity, including Crimea. This did not happen. Crimea left. In order to solve the problem of Donbass, they were agreed. Once again, Russia has shown its willingness to negotiate. The Minsk agreements are already in February of the 2015 year. Subsequently, we found out that no one was going to fulfill them, neither France, nor Germany, nor even Ukraine. And all these years, in violation of the ceasefire principle, the Kiev regime attacked the Donbass. And everything ended up the way it ended in February 2022 year. But if the Minsk agreements were fulfilled, Ukraine would again be whole without Crimea. But on the other hand, the whole of Donbass, the whole of Novorossiya, would be Ukrainian. No, for the second time, non-negotiability played a cruel joke with Ukraine. For the third time, Ukraine had a chance to preserve at least some kind of statehood in April of the 22nd year, when, after several rounds of negotiations between Russian and Ukrainian representatives, the Istanbul agreements were agreed. Preserving Ukraine minus Crimea, a significant part of Donbass, not joining NATO. Security guarantees outside the military blocs. You know the fate. Rahami himself, who headed the Ukrainian delegation, admitted that Boris Johnson had arrived and forbade signing the already initial document. The third example is when Russia shows its goodwill. I was going to negotiate, and when the opposite side, I would even say the opposite side, were incapable of negotiating. Every time the agreements reached were destroyed with the Ukrainians and their masters, Ukraine lost more and more territories. Our last proposal, which the President made on June 14th, speaking at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is that we are ready for negotiations based on the recognition of realities. And the realities include, first of all, amendments to the Constitution of the Russian Federation, according to which not only the Republic of Crimea, but also the DPIE, LPR, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions, are now an integral part of the territory of the Russian Federation in America. The realities on Earth also include the situation that all our Western partners, yes, unfortunately, some countries in other regions that put forward various initiatives are ignored. And the situation is that the rights of the Russian-speaking, Russian population of Ukraine are trampled. Russian language education laws have been adopted, laws prohibiting Russian mass media, both mass media that are located in Russia and worked in Ukraine, and purely Ukrainian mass media that work in Russian. Russian culture is banned. In Kiev, regulations have been issued separately that simply stop any cultural activity in Russian. And this is also a reality on Earth, which is unacceptable and persistent. And the intentions declared by their Kiev and the West to make Ukraine a member of NATO.
намерение сделать Украину членом НАТО.
All these things should be realized and eliminated.
Осознанно и ликвидировано.
The West has made it a rule, in any of its statements on Ukraine, to accuse us of aggression, completely ignoring what it has been doing from the Kiev regime for 10 years and declaring that Russia should withdraw its troops. The only basis for a settlement.
В течение 10 лет. И заявляя о том, что Россия должна вывести свои войска, и единственная основа для урегулирования.
This is the UNCharter, which requires respect for the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine.
Требующий уважения территориальной целостности и суверенитета Украины.
This is another nasty habit of the West.
Знаете, вот гаденькая привычка Запада.
Pull out only what he needs.
Что ему нужно.
Just like they cancel history, there was nothing. They count in Ukraine until February 2022 year.
Февраля 22 года
Everything was wonderful, and Russia suddenly broke in.
ворвалась.
And there are many such examples. And by canceling culture, canceling some periods of history that are unprofitable to it, the West is trying to apply this method of its own to the interpretation of international law.
Вот этот свой метод и толкование международного права.
Eustefan,
Фон
we are all for the settlement to be based on the UNCharter.
лежал устав ООН.
Russian, but it all started in Ukraine with the coming to power of the Nazi regime, which banned the Russian language, and declared war on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is the canonical sister of the Russian Orthodox Church. Chapter 1 of the UNCharter, long before the Charter, mentions the principle of territorial integrity. States that everyone is obliged to respect and observe human rights regardless of race, gender, language, and religion.
Языка и религии.
It is directly said, do not touch the language, religion. This principle was violated much earlier than Ukraine, by its own actions, by its non-negotiability, brought down its territorial integrity.
Обрушила свою территориальную целостность.
The second question is about another principle of the He Charter,
Устав ООН
the right of a nation to self-determination. And it is also mentioned in the text of the Charter much earlier than the principle of territorial integrity. And eventually the General Assembly.
Ассамблея
There were contradictions in the interpretations of the nation's right to self-determination and territorial integrity.
территориальная целостность
In 1970th year, the UN Assembly unanimously decided in the Declaration on the Principles of International Law that all states, all are obliged to respect the territorial integrity of those states whose governments respect the principle of self-determination, and therefore represent all the people living on this territory.
всего этого представляют весь народ, проживающий на данной территории.
But after the coup, when the Nazis who came to power announced the abolition of the Russian language in Ukraine, did they represent the residents of Crimea, the residents of Donbass, Novorossiya?
Представляли жителей Крыма, жителей Донбасса, Новороссии.
Oh no. Therefore, this distortion is a vile way of turning everything in its favor. It is inherent in the West.
Подлая манера выворачивать все в свою пользу, она Западу присуща.
But we will insist that the eventual, I hope, political settlement is really at the heart of it. We are still ready for it. It will run the Charter, but not the articles pulled out of it, which the West is ready to use in its interests today.
Но не выдернутые из него статьи, которые вот сегодня Запад готов применить в своих интересах.
And all the principles of the Charter, all the goals and principles of the Charter in their entirety, in all their interrelation. Because in Crimea, when the referendum was held, the West said, this is a violation of the principle of territorial integrity. When independence was declared in Kosovo without any referendum, the West declared that this was the realization of the nation's right to self-determination. A vile, unscrupulous position, like many other approaches of the West in the past centuries, and now.
Прошлые столетия и сейчас.
I have talked about this at such length because you asked the most important question about what is at the heart of Russian diplomacy. and without showing by examples how important honesty and respect for international law in all its diversity is for us, it is very difficult to explain why Russia refuses to respect the sovereignty of Ukraine in accordance with the Charter of.
Очень трудно объяснить, почему Россия отказывается от требования уважать суверенитет Украины в соответствии с уставом ООН.
It's crux simple. So our position, it is not perfect, no one is perfect, as the heroes of one Hollywood movie said, but at least, we are ready to defend and defend it.
По крайней мере, мы готовы ее защищать и отстаивать.
And I gave examples of what the UNCharter is and how these articles, how someone applies these principles, and someone does not want to apply them.
Кто-то, а кто-то не хочет применять.
We are ready for an honest conversation, but tomorrow we are not ready for an honest conversation. He has no arguments. You know, even when Soviet representatives were accused of reading out the editorial of the truth on a piece of paper. I'll tell you, the Soviet representatives at the UN were much more, if you like, inventive, creative, in presenting a really rigidly established position.
В подаче, да, действительно жестко установленной позиции.
West, that you read the New York Times, that you listen to the American representative.
Американского представителя.
It is a continuous agitation, which does not even carry any attempt to justify its unacceptable approaches with at least some facts.
Подхода хоть какими-то фактами.
Nothing but slogans and demands.
Повторю, я, наверное,
I can be passionate about advertising Russian diplomacy, but we are ready to discuss these issues, but honestly. Sergey Viktorovich, how would you assess the impact of language training on your diplomatic career? Of course, a diplomat cannot work without a language. We have now in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Previously, in Soviet times, it was necessary to take one language and then, working in the media, study the second, the third.
второй, третий.
Now we hire only those who are interviewed into foreign languages.
Проходит собеседование по двум иностранным языкам.
As I have already said, MGIMO has expanded the number of foreign languages that are taught now, and we are already starting to get results.
Получать результат.
Guys come with knowledge of Oriental, rare languages, and they are already actively involved in the work with a very good prospect. Because Oriental languages, I am convinced, their importance will only increase.
Я убежден, их значение будет только возрастать.
A diplomat must know the language, because no matter what kind of negotiations there are in the microphone with translation, translation is also a very important thing.
Тоже очень важная вещь.
All the same, a one-on-one meeting without outsiders is very often decisive in resolving some major crisis, as it was in 1962 during the Caribbean crisis, when Ambassador Dobrynin Anatoly Fedorovich met one-on-one with President Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy.
Посол Добрынин Анатолий Федорович встречался один на один с братом президента Кеннеди, с Робертом Кеннеди.
And then, in general, a lot was predetermined.
Многое было предрешено.
But in real life, the language should be perfect for a diplomat.
Язык должен быть идеальным для дипломата.
I said that we employ people who know two foreign languages and encourage new applicants in every possible way to either improve their language skills or learn a new language or do both together in our higher foreign language courses.
И то, и другое вместе на наших высших курсах иностранных языков.
This is the oldest educational institution with excellent traditions.
Традициями.
We really appreciate it. This is really a way to improve your skills and hone your language skills.
Такой способ повысить квалификацию и отточить свои языковые способности.
I mentioned translators too. Despite the fact that a diplomat is obliged to know the language, translators are also very necessary. Very important, because in the modern world, diplomacy deals with everything and everything. Not only issues of war and peace, as it was before, in the Middle Ages, and in many ways in the 19th century.
В средние века и во многом в XIX веке.
Now, if we take the structure of the UN bodies, the UN system deals with, in addition to military political issues, the economy, humanitarian, social issues, refugees, healthcare, cybersecurity has firmly fit into the UN agenda.
Беженцами, здравоохранением. Уже кибербезопасность прочно вписалась в повестку дня ООН.
Intellectual property, a special agency exists. Sustainable development, everything connected with it. A process has been created on climate, which is being carried out under the auspices of the United Nations, and is currently being prepared, or rather even disputes about how to design which body, so that it deals with artificial intelligence. That is, all spheres of human life. And there are diplomats in each of these spheres, but in most of them our main departments are economic, technological, military, healthcare, and many others. As chief specialists, they play a leading role, and diplomats accompany them.
Главные специалисты, они играют ведущую роль, а дипломаты их сопровождают.
And this, by the way, explains that MGIMO's training programs are also growing.
Разрастается и учебные программы МГИМО.
Rosneft and Transneft have opened their departments. Even the medical direction.
Медицинское есть сейчас направление МГИМО.
Many people laughed at this, but remember how the coronavirus pandemic took place. What political passions really developed around the World Health Organization, around how the European Commission tried to fraudulently bargain for an advantage for Western vaccines, Pfizer and AstraZeneca. How they worked with the World Health Organization to undermine the position of the Russian satellite vaccine and others ours, and our other vaccines.
Pfizer и AstraZeneca, как они работали с Всемирной организацией здравоохранения, чтобы подорвать позиции российской вакцины «Спутник В» и других наших вакцин.
In other words, there is not a single sphere where there would not be a political struggle. Therefore, we definitely need to have specialists in modern methods of monitoring and regulating international cooperation, and healthcare, as in all other areas. International Telecommunication Union. For many years, there have been discussions about how and who will manage the Internet. Americans, for obvious reasons, do not want to give up their almost monopoly positions. But the rest of the world community still wants more justice. Therefore, it is inevitable that MGIMO, as a university that trains personnel for international activities, should take all this into account and, as far as possible, include appropriate programs in its work. And translators still play an important role. There are cases when, even in Soviet times, there was such a thing when the main head of the delegation at various levels does not state the position very well. It happens, they give him a memo. A good translator will always delicately, imperceptibly correct and reflect the nuance that was missed. There is also the opposite situation, when the head of the delegation knows the language himself. But negotiations are conducted in languages, in Russian, and in the language of the partner. And sometimes the head of the delegation, such cases have been in history, corrected the translator. It's embarrassing. But everything happens in life. This is one more time to say that it is necessary to pay attention to the training of translation personnel. MGIMO has bachelor's and master's degrees, and there is a practice of regular internships of translators who are preparing for international activities for both translation and simultaneous translation. They are interning at the UN, and good contacts have been established. Traditionally, INYAS, now Moscow State Pedagogical University, was engaged in this, the University of Foreign Languages. But for us this INYAS cannot be thrown out of our hearts. Yaz and I were very close friends. And, of course, it is necessary to encourage those who know many languages. In Soviet times, we received a 5% surcharge for the Western language, 10% for the Eastern language. 20% was the ceiling. It seems to me that this needs to be corrected somehow. It is necessary to encourage children to learn more languages. Alexander Sergeyevich Griboidov, when he entered the College of Foreign Affairs in 1817, in my opinion, he was given the position of a clerk of the 12th grade. And as he worked, it turned out that he knows 10 foreign languages. He was immediately promoted to a rank that was 2 heads higher, and he began to receive 7 times more money. So we have a lot to strive for. There is experience that has proven its effectiveness, including, of course, the experience of Soviet diplomacy and the experience that we have already gained over the past decades as the Russian Federation. You answered everything simply. Now there are questions, even those that were further away.